We begin the readout tonight with a dramatic day in court at the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Last week, we heard from multiple police officers that Chauvin's actions that day, specifically keeping his knee on George Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes, even after Floyd no longer had a pulse, violated the police department's use of force policy. Well, today, it was the Minneapolis Police Chief himself making the case that almost everything Chauvin did that day was wrong.
Do you believe that the defendant followed departmental policy 5-304 regarding de-escalation?
I absolutely do not.
Was this a trained Minneapolis Police Department defensive tactics technique?
It is not.
Is it your belief then that this particular form of restraint, if that's what we'll call it, in fact violates departmental policy?
I absolutely agree that violates our policy.
Is what you see in Exhibit 17, in your opinion, within Minneapolis Police Departmental Policy 5-300, authorizing the use of reasonable force?
It is not.
In a striking moment, the police chief spoke directly to the jury and made it clear that Chauvin did not represent his police force.
Once there was no longer any resistance, and clearly when Mr. Floyd was no longer responsive and even motionless, to continue to apply that level of force to a person proned out, handcuffed behind their back, that in no way, shape, or form is anything that is by policy. It is not part of our training, and it is certainly not part of our ethics or our values.
It was Arredondo, who is also Minneapolis's first black police chief, who fired Chauvin and the 3 other officers involved in Floyd's death just a day after the incident last May. A few weeks after that, he released a statement calling Floyd's death a murder. Arredondo wrote, "Mr. George Floyd's tragic death was not due to a lack of training. The training was there. Chauvin knew what he was doing. The officers knew what was happening. One intentionally caused it, and the others failed to prevent it. This was murder. It wasn't a lack of training." With me now is Paul Butler, Georgetown law professor and former federal prosecutor, and former Detroit Police Chief Ralph Godbee. Thank you both for being here. And Chief Godbee, I want to start with you first, because one of the many things I found extraordinary about this case is the number of police officers testifying for the prosecution, the number of the fellow police officers of Derek Chauvin coming out strongly against him. Before I let you respond to that, I just want to let you listen to one more soundbite of Chief Arredondo. This was actually an interview with NBC News last June about Chauvin. Take a listen.
If you could look and be in the same room with Derek Chauvin, what would you say to him?
I would not be in the same room with him, and I refuse to mention his name.
He also talked about the need for police to be part of the community, to engage with the community. He talked a little bit about that today. What do you make, Chief Godbee, of just this man testifying against Chauvin and all the other police who have done so?
Well, Joy, I don't think we can underestimate the seminal moment that we're witnessing for a chief of police. Chief Arredondo has set a new standard, a new bar for the expectation of police leadership. And I think his transparency, his candor, and his just ability to call balls and strikes. You can't make sense out of nonsense. And his ability to do that, I think that frees those beneath him of lower rank to really be courageous and bold to speak against a culture that's so entrenched in a thin blue line.
Yeah, there is no thin blue line in this case, Paul. This is, you wrote the book on chokeholds. I don't know if you find it as extraordinary as we do to hear police talk about other police this way.
It is. In most prosecutions of officers, police chiefs typically don't get involved in trials at all, or when they do, they seem to support their cop. So this was really a big deal, in part because it was the boss, but in part because of the extraordinary testimony. He couldn't actually say this time that he thinks that Chauvin is a murderer, because that's a decision that the jury has to decide. But a clear inference from his testimony today, Joy, was the chief of police thinks that one of the officers he employed is guilty of the ultimate crime.
Yeah, he made it clear. This wasn't our training. This wasn't policy. He was very clear. Let's play a little part of the defense attempting to sort of undercut him. So he tries to refute the chief's testimony by trying to, I guess, make what Chauvin did sound like some sort of weird form of de-escalation. Here's that.
If so.
Was your leading theory then for the cause of Mr. Floyd's cardiac arrest oxygen deficiency?
That was one of the more likely possibilities. I felt that at the time, based on the information I had, it was more likely than the other possibilities.
And doctor, is there another name for death by oxygen deficiency?
Asphyxia is a commonly understood term.
That actually was Dr. Bradford Langenfeld on the cause of death. We're now going to play, so we're going to come back to that in a second. Now, this is the chief reacting to the defense, trying to sort of make this look like de-escalation, what Chauvin did. Take a look.
Sometimes de-escalation, again, includes the use of force, right? The use of force can be a de-escalation tactic.
I was thinking of your example of displaying your weapon, and so I don't have a lot of knowledge in terms of physical force being used to actually de-escalate a situation, but the threatening use of force or threatening verbally, I'm more familiar with that.
Chief Godby, how long have you been a cop? May I ask you what's your number of years experience?
I started at 19. I just left policing last year, so over 35 years in law enforcement. And I must say, Joy,
yeah,
if I could, positional asphyxia, and I'm sure Professor Butler can attest to this, absent 3 people on your back and 1 individual on your throat. For the past 20 to 25 years in policing, we have been very, very sensitive positional asphyxia. If he were just laying on his stomach with his hands cuffed behind him, he was still subject to die in that circumstance. What Chauvin did exacerbated it, and I'm just so proud of Chief Arredondo for not buying into the nonsensical arguments of the defense.